Jamia Millia Islamia has collaborated with California State University, Sacramento, USA, for the third lecture in the webinar series on Gandhian Thought and Philosophy. The first lecture in this series was held in collaboration with the University of Oxford, UK, and the second was in association with Seoul National University, Republic of Korea. It is through the legacy of Gandhi that we have forged abiding relationship with these top universities in the world. This webinar series is consistent with the University Grants Commission's proposal to celebrate 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi for dissemination of Gandhian thought and philosophy in intellectual circles. The University Grants Commission, and I would like to say for the benefit of our international audience, is a statutory organization of the Ministry of Education, Government of India, for the coordination, determination, and maintenance of standards of teaching, examination, and research in university education. For this webinar, we have participants from different parts of the world associated with educational institutions that we have developed academic collaborations through MOUs. They are attending this event from different geographical locations across different time zones through the WebEx platform. We have a modest assemblage of very distinguished panelists here. The panelists here will comment on the current relevance of Mahatma Gandhi, his impact on our consciousness in terms of our engagement with the world and environment. Today, we would get to hear how Gandhi's life, or shall we say, his practice of living, impacted our consciousness in terms of conservation and ecological balance for harmonious coexistence of organisms and their environment. Gandhiji so perceptively observed that the great nature has intended us to earn our bread by the sweat of our brow. He also added, and I quote, "I venture to suggest that it is the fundamental law of nature, without exception, that nature produces enough for our wants from day to day. And if only everybody took enough for himself and nothing more, there would be no pauperism in this world. There would be no man dying of starvation in this world," unquote. He also looked at acquisitiveness as not only wasteful, but also immoral. Today, we are presenting a lecture titled Gandhi and the US Environmental Movement by Professor Ajay Singh, Department of Environmental Studies, California State University, Sacramento. It is indeed our honor and privilege to have him with us. We are extremely fortunate to have amidst us Professor Robert S. Nelson, President, California State University, Sacramento, as the chief guest. President Nelson is ceaselessly working to bring about a transformative change in California State University by introducing diversity through the process of equity and inclusion. His interventions have made Sacramento State one of the greenest campuses in the world. It is also ranked as one of the top internship destinations in the US and boasts of specialized research centers and institutes. We are blessed to have one of the top academic leaders in the world with us today. Sir, we have so much to learn from your exemplary leadership and strategic interventions. The webinar session would be chaired by Professor Najma Akhar, Vice Chancellor, Jamia Millia Islamia. Professor Akhar is the first woman Vice Chancellor of this university that is celebrating its centenary year. Under her leadership, the university has attained newer heights and its outstanding performances are being widely discussed. She is an abiding source of inspiration for all. Before we get started, I would remind the attendees that if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in WebEx control panel. We will pass on the questions to the panelists during the Q&A session to elicit their response. The structure of this webinar, however, offers the limits of time. Now, I will request the esteemed Vice Chancellor, Jamia Millia Islamia, Professor Najma Akhar, to give her welcome address and conduct the proceedings. Over to you, ma'am.
I welcome my guests from USA. Good morning and namaskar. President Robert S. Nelson, our chief guest, the Vice Chancellor, the President of California State University at Sacramento, and Professor Ajay Singh, the distinguished speaker today. My learned panelists, esteemed guests, and from California State University, Sacramento, USA, and from all over the world where we have collaborative partners, also from the Ministry of Education and the University Grants Commission officials in India, and my colleagues from my university, students, guests, and ladies and gentlemen. This it's a great pleasure indeed, a very great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the webinar on Gandhian Thoughts and Philosophy organized by the Jamia Millia Islamia in collaboration with its partner and in collaboration with its US university partner, that's California State University, Sacramento, USA. This webinar is an outcome of the collaborative partnership Jamia has forged with California State University, Sacramento earlier this year. And this, I am happy to say, is the first activity between these two universities, and that too during the COVID-19 period, and which shows that we have all the intentions of working together in various ways. I'm happy that Professor Nelson and Professor Ajay Singh have agreed to come and address this group across India, across the world also. And we have this, as this is an important opportunity for India to speak on Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian knowledge about him and how his philosophy has influenced the other countries, other policies, and so this is an appropriate and very important topic also on which this lecture is going to be there. I'm very happy and grateful that the distinguished scholars and teachers have come from abroad and joined today to share their knowledge and experience and to explore how this could have the philosophy and thought of the father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi, could be disseminated in intellectual circles for the betterment of the world. I'm extremely delighted to welcome Professor Robert S. Nelson, President, California State University, Sacramento. Sir, you would remember I have come to your office and met you several times, and I'm so happy to welcome you here. I'm happy that you readily agreed to participate in this webinar despite your very hectic schedule, despite the corona limitations and the difficult times which given in the difference because of the difference in time zones. Your presence today only goes to demonstrate how deeply you are committed to strengthen our collaborative partnership. The two institutions have shared academic values and now are in pursuit of excellence in all domains of knowledge and of sharing. I was very impressed by the California State University in Sacramento, as this is one of the leading institutions in the US and is known for its pioneering teaching and research programs. I have seen that in Sacramento and this part of California, this is the first choice of the young students to go and join this university and then think of any other future later on. President Nelson's leadership has taken the university to a higher level. It's our honor and privilege to have you with us, Professor Nelson, and you're welcome to India. Welcome to Jamia. It is also very heartening to have Professor Ajay Singh from the Department of Environmental Studies, California State University, as the main speaker of this event, who would share perspectives on Gandhi's influence on environmental movement, more particularly in the context of US. This is definitely a new angle from which we are looking at Gandhiji and his teachings and his philosophy, and is very much welcome today. I'm, uh, I'm happy to welcome you, Professor Ajay Singh, and I shall have the occasion to introduce each one of them, each one of our guests from USA, separately in the course of this webinar. By way of my opening remarks, I would like to say that India is celebrating the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. And with a lot of pomp and show, with a lot of happiness, we are doing it because Mahatma Gandhi was the leader at that time when India was trying to get the freedom, and we owe a lot to him. Gandhi's environmentalism fitted with his overall vision for India and for the world that sought to draw from nature what is absolutely necessary for human subsistence. His idea on environment was intimately linked with his ideas relating to polity, economy, health, and development. What is very interesting is that the concepts of ecology and environmentalism never figured in his writing and his speeches, yet he was seen as a thinker with profound ecological sensibility, and his thinking has exercised far reaching influence on ecological movements in India and abroad. Today we'll be listening to Professor Ajay Singh about this angle only. The Norwegian philosopher Mr. Hans Nies, who propounded the vision of deep ecology, has attributed his realization to Gandhi's idea of the essential oneness of all life. Environmental consciousness is a phenomenon. We all know that which it has gained momentum only in the last 5 decades or so. This consciousness is implicit in worldviews, traditions, culture, religion, and folklore of countless societies. Ecology is a subject that seeks to understand the relationship between living organisms and their environment. Human ecology visualizes human beings and their environment as constituting an integrated whole. The propensity to compartmentalize and segregate everything into different categories does not agree with the ecological perspective. Gandhi perceived the interconnectedness of everything in his writings, and we find elements of economics, elements of politics, sociology, and ethics forming a united whole. Gandhi said, I believe in Advaita, which means non duality. I believe in the essential unity of man and, for that matter, of all that lives. Gandhi observed that the traditional archives of knowledge, religion, sociology, and economy have all been separate and exclusive spheres. Man has been divided. Man has been divided into various watertight compartments. The left hand is not knowing what is the right hand is doing. Nature does not recognize such divisions. She deals with all life as a whole. Now, with all everything which is going on in the world, with all the pollution, with all the things that we have done to the nature, we can understand what Gandhiji said at that time. Gandhi did not recognize separate rules for separate spheres of human life, but saw all spheres holistically. The issues currently discussed under the label of environment are not prominent during his lifetime. It was not much talked about during his life. However, his description of modern industrial civilization as a 7-day wonder contains a prognosis and a warning. Gandhi had anticipated most of the environmental problems that we face today. He envisaged an ecological or basic need model centered on limitation of wants, in contrast to the modern civilization that promoted material warfare and profit motive. Gandhi said, I quote, a certain degree of physical harmony and comfort is necessary, but above that level, it becomes a hindrance because of, therefore, the idea of creating an unlimited number of wants and satisfying them seems to be a delusion and a snare. According to him, a man who multiplies his daily wants cannot achieve the goals of plain living and high thinking. Gandhi warned against the perils of industrialization. He told an interlocutor in 1928, God forbid that India should never take to industrialization after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom, that is England, is today keeping the world in chains. That's what Gandhi said. And if an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. Gandhiji was of the view that nature should be allowed to take its own course. Our gross and appalling instrumentalization of nature has precipitated environmental crisis and extreme world conditions. The earth is not to be viewed as a repository that is to be mined, excuse me. I repeat that the world is not to be viewed as a repository that is to be mined, logged, or hollowed out. Any endeavor to alter the course of nature would amount to legislating for regulating the health of all species. Gandhi never wrote any ecological treatise, but he made one of his life. He showed what he believed in by being that. Thank you very much. It is indeed going to be a good lecture that we are waiting for. I will now request Professor S. Nelson, Robert S. Nelson, to address the group and begin this webinar formally. And let me introduce him very briefly before I ask him for the inaugural address. Professor Robert Nelson, born in January 21st, 1952, is an American academic administrator, currently serving as the 8th President of California State University, Sacramento, since July 1st, 2015. Professor Robert Nelson was born in Brigham City, Utah, and raised in Medicine Country, Montana. He earned a bachelor's and a master's degree in political science from Brigham Young University and a PhD from University of Chicago. And he specialized in modern literature and modern philosophy and modern political theory. Prior to becoming the CSUS president, he was serving as special advisor to the University of Texas Systems Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Nelson served as the 8th President of the University of Texas Pan American from January 2010 to August 2014. Prior to that, Professor Nelson was an Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Professor of English at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. Earlier, Nelson was a faculty member at the University of Texas at Dallas. He served as the Speaker of the faculty and chaired the University of Texas System Faculty Advisory Council. After winning the Chancellor's Council Award for outstanding teaching, he was recruited into the Provost office and served as Vice Provost there. Professor Nelson is an author of fiction in journals which include the Story Quarterly, Other Voices, Clariton Review, and Southwest Review. He lives with his wife in the East Sacramento neighborhood of Sacramento, California. I must also mention that he is the recipient of several honors and rewards, which it won't be possible for me to read out because there are so many. And he has not only been getting a reward every year, but sometimes 2 or 3 rewards per year, which made us realize, in fact, we must realize that what type of writings Professor Nilsson was involved in and what type of appreciation he was getting. If you allow me, I will not go through the whole list. It's a very long list, and but I'll separate it among all my participants so that they can know what is person they are listening to. And without wasting much time now, I want to request you, Professor Nelson, to the chief guest of this webinar, to inaugurate the webinar formally and give the inaugural address. Professor Robert Nelson, please.
Chancellor, I had the privilege to be able to meet with you in my office in Sacramento. It was one of the highlights of the year. I am so grateful for everything we are doing with your university. Thank you for having me here today. I am Robert S. Nelson, President of Sacramento State. I am deeply, deeply appreciative to Vice Chancellor Akhar and to everyone who worked to make this event possible. It is my pleasure to be here today to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi's birth. Gandhian thought and philosophy continue to influence much of what we do today. Every day, I see American society struggling with the fundamental tenet of Gandhian ideology, transforming the self while also transforming the society simultaneously. In this time of great stress from the pandemic and the ongoing racial unrest, we know that both must happen to make true progress. Gandhi's beliefs in truth, nonviolence, morality, and harmony deeply reflect my own. We must find ways to love one another and to work together for a better world. At Sacramento State, speak about how we must work to be a caring campus I believe that that is what your university is striving to be also. The desire that you have to serve and offer a progressive education to all students from all communities is commendable, more important than ever. I believe that what you are doing and what we are doing tonight is transformative. And I'm proud that Sacramento State is partnered with such esteemed university. The work to create a sense of shared identity and culture for all communities in India, but especially for Indian Muslims, is vital to achieve a true cultural renaissance. I would like to extend my congratulations to you for reaching the astounding milestone of 100 years of education and empowerment. Think about that. 100 years this university has brought education to those who want it most. I wish you 100 years more of doing this good work to provide a progressive education while building a shared worldview and a sense of belonging. Thank you again for having me here today, and I look forward to a long and deep and continued partnership and collaboration. And now I'm so pleased to hand over this virtual microphone to Dr. Ajay Singh from the Department of Environmental Studies at Sacramento State University. I don't just hope, but I know that you will find his remarks on Gandhi and the U.S. environmental movement to be worthwhile. Dr. Singh, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being who you are at Sacramento State.
Well, thank you very much, President Nelson. I really appreciate those words. And to the Vice Chancellor, if I may, I'll share my screen and my presentation, if that's okay.
Let me just welcome you.
Okay.
Introduce you and welcome you. Thank you, Professor Nelson, for your very kind words about my university, and also sharing what your great university is doing, how you are finding ways to love and serve students from all communities there. And it is quite visible, because I have seen that that's a first choice university in California, and a lot of students have put their future in your hands, which you are handling very capably. I'm also happy that you mentioned that you are proud to partner with Jamia. Let me say that we are also equally proud, very proud to partner with your university, with the state, California State University, because even in the COVID-19 season has not stopped us from coming together and sharing each other's resources and knowledge. So this shows that our intention to stay together is very much there. I'm also equally happy that Professor Nelson and Professor Ajay Singh have come to us in a very auspicious year, which is our 100th year. And it's not always, not every year that you become a 100 years old university. This year, we had all the plans to celebrate it in a big way, but because of Corona, we are doing it online mostly. but nothing is stopping us from reaching out to eminent people like you, Professor Nelson and Professor Ajay Singh, and share your knowledge and expose this this university, show that this university is there with us as a partner. So let me introduce Professor Ajay Singh. Professor Ajay Singh teaches at the Department of Environmental Studies in California State University, Sacramento. He did his postdoctorate in forestry and natural resources, Purdue University, and PhD in environment and natural resources from Ohio State University, Columbus, and his BA in geography from University of Oregon, Eugene. I must mention here, Professor Ajay Singh, that we are going to start a new department of environmental studies, and we'll look forward for your guidance and want you to be part of it at the very starting of the department. Prior to joining California State University, Professor Ajay Singh had held academic positions at Ohio State University and at Bertie Glen Community College. His professional appointment includes Director, Keys and West, Watershed Coordinator, Glen Country, Resource Conservation District, and Natural Resource Volunteer, Peace Corps, Honduras, and besides this, he has taught courses on environmental politics and policy, environmental science, environmental management and decision making, international environmental problems, sustainability science, and policy and environmental and natural resources policy. It is so very obvious that he is one of the most distinguished environmentalists to talk on Gandhi and environmental movements across the globe. Professor Ajay Singh has several publications to his credit and has extensively published in the field of environment and natural resource policy. Before I request Professor Ajay Singh to make his presentation, I must say that I'm tempted to offer you as to come and join Jamia, because you are the right person to guide us on our new Department of Environmental Studies. Although, take it seriously. And I would now request Professor Ajay Singh to make your presentation today. And let us talk about the topic that you have chosen, a very important topic, and that makes us look at Gandhiji's philosophy from a different angle. Professor Ajay Singh, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, I'm very happy that you are starting your own Department of Environmental Studies, and I'd be very honored to provide you with as much advice as you would want. Yes, so I will share my screen really quickly. And I'm also honored to talk to you today as well, because there you go. Because it is Gandhiji's 150th anniversary of his birth. And when I was asked to make this presentation, as an American-born Desi, I'd grown up hearing about Gandhi and studying about Gandhi. And so making the connection between Gandhi and environmentalism was a no-brainer for me. But as I started to do some research into this and taking a look at what is Gandhiji's influence on the US environmental movement, I was quite surprised by the lack of writings or the lack of mention that Gandhiji gets in our field here in the United States. So today, as it was pointed out, there's very little connecting Gandhiji with the environmental movement, but I will make the case, as others have, that the way that he lived his life was in line with the environmental movement. and he has taught us quite a bit about how we can go about protecting the environment and securing access to natural resources, especially for those in poverty. So what I would like you to understand by the end of this presentation is I'd like you to understand that there's a connection between Gandhian ethics and environmental thought. And I will step through some of the articles and publications and writings from academics in India and abroad making that connection. But as was pointed out, making the connection between Gandhi and the US environmental movement, like as I said, I made that connection very early on in my studies, but seeing that there is a lack of that connection, I was very happy to make this presentation because it started to get me to think about his influence on what it is that I do today. So what I will argue is that he not only had an influence on social movements, but I will make the case that he also made an influence on what I call individual pro-environmental behavior. I will also make the argument that he influenced pro-environmental political behavior here in the United States and what that has looked like over the last few decades. So in reading about Gandhiji and the connection to ecology and environmentalism, I was surprised to see that Gandhi is not seen as an environmentalist as we use that word today. But he inspired the environmental movement, especially in India, and the most prominent example of that being the Chipko movement. And as was also pointed out by the Vice Chancellor, is that there was no writing specific to nature or to the environment. And so many times we had to infer from his writings, from the things that he said, about what his view of environmentalism would be. But what we can glean from some of his writings is that he did have a very utilitarian view of nature and the environment. Nature was seen as a natural resource. It was seen as something that could be used by humans, especially those in rural areas, and that we needed to think about how it is that we provide access to natural resources and how our decisions impact those who are less fortunate. But what I will say is that I believe that he provided a template for how it is that we think about the environment, how we speak about the environment, and especially how we conduct ourselves in our relationship to the environment. The easiest connection that we can make is the idea of nonviolence, and especially nonviolence towards other beings, that were inspired by his study of both Jainism and Buddhism. And what was particularly insightful was that he had already made the connection that there was no dualism, meaning that there was no separation between humans and the environment, that humans were of the environment, and that lives of other species were also important in conjunction with human lives. And so even early on, he was making those connections well before what we consider to be the beginning of the environmental movement and the study of ecology. So one of the direct links between Gandhiji and environmentalism, as the Vice Chancellor pointed out, was the connection to deep ecology. Deep ecology is an idea, a philosophy that was developed by two philosophers, Arne Naas, a Norwegian philosophist, and George Sessions, who was a professor of philosophy in a college right here in Sacramento. And as they were developing their philosophy that we now call deep ecology, is that they also saw that at the core of deep ecology was the idea of nonviolence. And so Nas talked about and wrote about and was a student of Gandhiji and credits him as, in part, as inspiration for deep ecology. Now, to give you an idea of what deep ecology is this idea of biocentric egalitarianism and the idea that we are not the center of the universe and that other species and natural resources in the earth is not just for us to use, but that we are of the environment, our environment. And so there's a big pushback on the idea that of anthropocentrism and of ecological hierarchy that places us at the top. So this connection and the fact that Arne Nas writes about and gives credit to Gandhiji is probably the strongest connection between Gandhiji and the environmental movement. Even in one of the biggest connections that Arne Nas writes about is this idea of self-realization. This idea that we will live our lives and live through a process of increasing one's potential to the greatest possible degree. And Arne Nas created this idea of how it is that we can change our own actions and our own behaviors to try to live to the Gandhian ethic. And this idea is that we must have both self-realization and that we should refrain from violence to ourselves. And through that, we can also be nonviolent towards others. But this idea that we must have go through this process of self-realization, that we need to go through that process of self-realization, it's only then that we could then practice nonviolence towards not only ourselves, others, and other living species. So I, as an early student of deep ecology, when I was an undergraduate in Oregon, read deep ecology and was particularly influenced by this and had no idea that Arne Nas and others in the deep ecology movement were drawing quite a bit from Gandhiji. So it was very nice to see, and I was very happy to see that link was being made very early on in the environmental movement here in the United States. So there is a connection between Gandhiji, even though we might not see him as an environmentalist, or his writings and in his speeches aren't directly referencing nature or the environment. He did have an influence on pro-environmental behavior, both here in the US and abroad. So I must stop first and talk about and discuss what is pro-environmental behavior. And it's this idea that there is speech, the decisions that we make, and the actions that we take minimize environmental degradation or increase protection of nature. And at the core of pro-environmental behavior is this idea that we would self-sacrifice and that we would sacrifice ourselves for others. As in the picture here with Gandhiji, this is during his hunger strike, where he was willing to sacrifice himself in order to help others. So with that, this idea that pro-environmental behaviors are essentially this idea of sacrificing either our material possessions or our opportunities is important. So what sort of influence has he had on pro-environmental behavior? The easiest connection to make is with sustainable development and sustainability. Sustainable development, if you take a look at the Millennium Sustainable Development Goals, you see that they are trying to address many of the things that Gandhiji was trying to address, including addressing poverty, access to resources, and having a sustainable livelihood. And at the core of both sustainable development and sustainability is this idea of not having excess material, or taking too much, or taking too more than we actually need to sustain our lives. So it's this idea of non-materialism is quite, in his life of living without material excess is quite a good connection between sustainable development and Gandhiji. We also see that Gandhiji, and the way that he lived his life, it was this idea that he was living very simply. And through his actions and through his own lifestyle, he had quite an influence even on their author, E.F. Schumacher, the author of Small is Beautiful, which also had a large impact on me as an undergraduate, because it espoused this idea of self-reliance, that we do need to think about how it is that how can we live our lives without minimizing our impact on the environment. And also this idea of a focus on local, as Gandhiji, who spun his own wool to make his own clothes, and also espoused the idea that we should be buying and supporting local economies over large corporations, is something that I believe that E.F. Schumacher was quite influenced by. So this idea of living simply, again, is something that Gandhiji lived himself. But here in the US, we are only starting to see much of the ideas of living simply. We have a movement to declutter, to reduce our consumption, and even to live in smaller homes. We have shows such as Tidying Up by Marie Kondo, who teaches us how to get rid of things that we don't need, and even things that we don't want, in order to have better connection to ourselves and to our own experiences. We've been seeing, especially with COVID, that there's this movement that people don't need to live in large homes anymore. And that we've seen that people, especially the younger generations, not wanting to have the large homes that we have been building over the last 50 years, but will give that up in order to live in a tiny home. Even here on Sacramento State campus, the construction management and engineering students built a tiny home, a sustainable tiny home, right here on campus as a model for how it is that we can live our lives here in Sacramento. And we're also seeing that there is this movement, again, especially in the younger generations, of anti-materialism, that they're now not wanting to spend their money on the accumulation of material goods, but more in life experiences. And so over and over, and you can see this in Instagram and feeds and Facebook, that they are wanting to live their life, to experience life more, and to put their resources and money towards that rather than accumulating wealth and material goods. We're also seeing here in the United States this artisan movement, this creative movement, where we are starting to think about what it is that we throw away and how we can repurpose it for another use. The picture here is one of my favorites, because this is an old piano that somebody turned into a bookshelf, and is something that is quite beautiful and quite utilitarian. But there are you can go on and take a look at many of the examples that people have made in taking something and turning it into something else and reducing what we call the waste stream. Here in California, that is quite a big topic. But we're also seeing that there are people who are focusing their attention on buying things within the local economy. The biggest being farmers markets. While this might be a daily event in parts of India, here in the United States, this is a relatively new phenomenon. It happens only on certain days of the week, where farmers will bring their wares, bring their food, and sell it directly to consumers This is a picture of one of the farmers markets, one of the largest farmers market here in Sacramento. But in Sacramento, we have a numerous farmers market around the city where farmers can sell their wares directly. We're also seeing that there is a movement to buy green products, to buy sustainable products, and to buy organic products. And this movement is in part because of this idea that we should be buying things that have less impact on our environment. And we're also seeing in the United States, especially amongst the younger generation, of vegetarianism and even veganism. And this is due in part because there are local products and even nationwide products that are providing proteins and providing substitutes for meat and dairy products. We're also seeing that, however, that the adoption of these practices and adoption of these behaviors is quite slow here in the United States. But as I said, younger generations are starting to adopt these behaviors at greater rates than even people in my generation. So I think, as I said, Gandhiji, while he didn't talk directly about environmentalism or even about pro-environmental behavior, just the way that he lived his life, he was shown as a model for how it is that we can live our lives. But even here in the United States. But one of the things that has less of a direct connection is the idea of his influence on pro-environmental political behavior here in the United States. So one of the earliest things that I learned when I was in grade school was about the Salt March. And this is probably an idea that is very well known in India, but here in the United States, it's less well known. But in 1930, this was an act of civil disobedience, where Gandhiji was asked by the burgeoning Indian government to protest the British monopoly, and he chose to protest the 1882 salt tax. And what this did is and for those that do not know, that are here in the United States, this is a very long, multiple week walk that he took with his followers and others to the sea in order to create salt and take it back for his use. And this movement, this walk, this act of civil disobedience gained global recognition, not only because of his self-sacrifice and that he was willing to walk so far for something so basic in order to protest colonial rule, but I also think that we can reframe this as the idea that this was a protest against the limited access to natural resources, because this was a monopoly held by the British, because this was a tax that was going to the British, that this access to natural resources is something that we take a look at and we study in the environmental studies and sciences. And it also speaks to this idea of sustainable livelihoods. But one of the key things, and I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but this idea of environmental justice and equity. Because this was an act of civil disobedience, because this was an act that was directly tying to a natural resource and the access to a natural resource, we could see this through the lens of environmental justice. And again, I'll come back to this towards the end of my talk. So according to Gandhiji's biographer, Ramachandra Guha, that Gandhi has influenced many political writers and many political leaders here in the United States, including Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez. For those of you who don't know the other names, many of these are the African-American political leaders who were monumental in the development of our civil rights movement in the 1960s. And Cesar Chavez, who was here in California, who was fighting for farm labor rights starting back in the 1970s through the 1980s. And he is celebrated here in California with his own Memorial Day. But as the Vice Chancellor pointed out, there's very few writings linking Gandhiji and the US environmental movement. I was quite surprised by this and also quite dismayed because, as I pointed out, I had already made that connection quite early on, as other writers has. But I believe that Gandhiji has had quite an influence on our political system. The one writing that I could find was a legal review that was published quite recently in 2013. And it was arguing for this idea that we need mindful environmental jurisprudence here in the United States. And they made this connection between Gandhian ethic and US environmental law when taking a look at a very important court case where an environmental group in Michigan sued Nestle Corporation, when the Nestle Corporation wanted to put in a water bottling plant and take out and use groundwater to do so. And so I thought this was a very interesting connection that these authors were making, because mindful environmental jurisprudence is quite an interesting term. But here in the United States, they're making this case because how it is that we see the environment in a legal aspect is quite problematic. Because we have what's called the reasonable use doctrine. The reasonable use doctrine is this idea that if we are not using it, and we are not using it in a reasonable manner, we do not have rights to it. So in the case of water, not only in the Nestle lawsuit and in the Nestle case, but also in the case of trying to keep water in the rivers here in California, a legal case needed to be made that keeping water in a river or keeping water in the ground is a reasonable use. Because, and that case was made, but is constantly under pressure by those who would like to use that water and do not see it as keeping it in the ground or in the river as wasting it. So this idea that Gandhi of humans as being trustees of the environment, not just users of natural resources. And also this idea of nonviolence as being welfare for all. And this gets to the idea of public trust, the public trust doctrine, and that the role of the government is to be that trustee of public goods, including environmental goods. And this is one of the founding principles which allows us to create a lot of the environmental laws and policies that we have today. So this idea that these writers made of mindful environmental jurisprudence, drawing upon Gandhi, is quite an interesting idea and something that I think that we should explore more, not only here in the US, but also abroad. So the connection between Gandhiji, nonviolence, civil disobedience, and protest. One of the earliest connections that we can make is to the 1970 Earth Day protest that was held here in the United States, and that we just celebrated our 50-year anniversary just this year. And because of this, because millions across the United States were willing to march for the Earth, was quite extraordinary and was believed to be one of the precipitating focal events that helped pass some of the major federal environmental policies, such as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act, and the Environmental Policy Act. These are some of the major federal laws and policies that we have on books that has helped us make some of the environmental strides that we've made in the last 50 years. So there we see that even early on in the environmental movement, that we were drawing upon some of the teachings and some of the actions of Gandhiji in order to accomplish political ends. We've also seen environmental protest in a number of cases, and I can't go through all the cases, but I wanted to go through a few. The early one, and one that had a big impact on me because I grew up in Northern California and I went to school in Oregon, was the protection of the endangered spotted owl. The spotted owl was only found in virgin forests in the Pacific Northwest and in Northern California. And so there was a big movement in the Pacific Northwest to protest against logging, especially in virgin forests. And what we saw was that people were willing to get in the way of logging machinery, to even put themselves up in the trees. And one person, Julia Butterfly, had spent more than 2 years in a tree to protest our logging practices. And certain environmental groups, such as Earth First, that came out of other environmental organizations, was really seen as being one of the champions of the logging industry, the logging protests against the logging industry. And even while they were involved in many of the nonviolent protests, they began to do what we call monkey wrenching, where they would go and they would sabotage machinery, logging machinery. And when that didn't stop many of the logging, they started to spike trees, putting large railroad spikes into trees in hopes that they would sabotage milling operations. But when that led to a death of a mill worker, that practice was disavowed and condemned by the environmental movement. And so that practice ceased. But right there, you see that there's direct links to not only nonviolent protest, but also to the Chipko movement, who was inspired by Gandhiji. However, since the 1970s, we've seen a backlash that has also used protest as a major function of how it is to gain national attention. In the 1980s, we had what's called the Wise Use movement. It's also called the Sagebrush Rebellion, where cattle ranchers in the West were protesting their limited access to ranch lands that are owned by the federal government. And that has culminated into two armed standoffs in 2014 between ranchers and the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada, and even led to an armed occupation of federal lands in a wildlife refuge in Oregon. Both of these were in protest of the Endangered Species Act and decisions made by the federal government to try to protect, in the case of Nevada, to protect the desert tortoise. But we've also seen that there's protests in other parts of the West having to do with the sage grouse and other migratory birds. So while we've seen some use of political protest as a way to gain national attention, we should also be very cognizant that how it is that we affect those, especially in rural communities, and those who depend on federal lands for their livelihoods. That's something that I believe that we should really think about as we start to think about how we implement our environmental laws and policies. But we have some more contemporary examples of the use of nonviolent protests in order to gain awareness, in order to gain action by our political leaders. Not only been climate change protests here in the United States, but we've seen them grow abroad and even inspiring people like Greta Thunberg, from a young teenager in Sweden, who has spoken not only here to the political and economic leaders here in the U.S., but also to the UN and to the G8, in order to raise awareness about our need, the political elite and that the economic elite need to address climate change. I also believe that while Gandhiji and the actions that he inspired through political protest, is that Gandhiji also, I believe, has a direct connection to environmental justice. And Gandhiji, this comes from Gandhiji talking about the ideas of fairness, justice, and rights, and human rights. So to give you an idea of what environmental justice is, this is a study of a phenomenon where a social, racial, or ethnic, economic group have limited access to natural resources or are exposed to toxins at a greater rate than other groups. And that this idea that that is unfair. And so within the environmental studies and environmental sciences, that is something that we are coming to terms with here in the United States. And I'll bring a couple of examples of that in just a second. But environmental justice is essentially the fair treatment and having a meaningful involvement in governmental decision-making and governmental actions. So what are some examples of this? One of the most contemporary and ongoing examples of this is the Keystone Pipeline. This is also called the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is an oil pipeline that's taking oil out of the tar sands in Ontario, or in Alberta, Canada, and piping it all the way down to refineries near the Gulf of Mexico in Texas. There's been protests because part of that pipeline will be built adjacent to tribal lands with no meaningful involvement. And one of their biggest concerns is that there is that the pipeline crosses a major waterway, a river, just upstream from their tribal lands. And so there's been numerous protests and occupation of lands near where the pipeline is supposed to be laid in order to protest the decision by the government to okay this pipeline. And this has gained not only local protests by tribal leaders, but this has gained nationwide protests and nationwide recognition of the decision that the federal government made. And this has led to many legal challenges, of which the last legal challenge is forcing the federal government to rethink their decision to okay that pipeline and the process of which they did under the National Environmental Policy Act, which means that there needs to be some sort of meaningful involvement of those who might be impacted by their decisions. Another case of this, in contemporary and unfortunately ongoing case of this, of environmental justice here in the United States, is a decision that was made by the state of Michigan to switch drinking water sources for the city of Flint in 2014. This was in response to lowering tax revenue due to 2008 Great Recession, not only here in the United States, but elsewhere, which bankrupted the city and forced the city services to have cost-cutting measures. However, in changing where they were getting their source of drinking water, there was no adequate study done on what might be the impacts of that switch. And what ended up happening was a corrosion of lead pipes in Flint, Michigan. And I should also point out that the switch was under protest from the local city council, whose power was taken away by the state of Michigan under the bankruptcy rule. And so the problem with this and what gained national attention is that Flint, Michigan is primarily low income and primarily African American community. And because this switch essentially corroded old pipes that were made from lead or used lead in their soldering, and this ended up having increasing lead exposure, so in some cases 1,000 times the legal limit, and that leads to public health impacts, including child development impacts. So this one decision that was made to save the city money and the state money actually has cost hundreds of millions of dollars and long-term effect on public health. This idea of using political protests, of using the legal process in order to protect the environment and public health, we have to ask ourselves, do environmental protests change government decision-making? A study in 2014 by Gillens and Page, political scientists from Princeton University and Northwestern University here in the US, took a look at different theories and different influences on the policy process. And they tested a couple of theories doing a meta-analysis. And what they found was that 60% of the time that policy was changed, it was more in line with political and economic elite interests. However, when it came to aligning with the general public policy change only accounted for 20% alignment. And when they did statistical tests, what they found was that public opinion did not have a significant impact on public policy here in the United States. Now, while this is quite depressing and quite dreary, what we must take into consideration is that they only took that quantitative data in public opinion polling. And the fact that public opinion is influenced by these environmental protests, it raises people's awareness. It shows people that other people who share similar views as themselves are concerned about environmental problems. And that will, in long term, influence political public opinion. So we must think about what is Gandhiji's environmental legacy. The easiest one is demonstrating that we can live simply and still meet our basic needs. And this idea that we need to not only think of wealth accumulation and material accumulation, but that we also must see ourselves in the process of self-realization with the goal of nonviolence towards ourselves, towards others, and towards other species. And I think that showing us, part of that legacy is just showing us that nonviolent civil disobedience can lead to political change, and that we can do it without any sort of armed conflict. And because of that, we have adopted that here in the United States and adopted that in our environmental movement. We must also think about, when we think about Gandhian ethics, I think that moving forward, that we must make the link between Gandhiji and environmental justice. That I believe that his teachings and his actions can speak to many of the mission and the goals of environmental justice. And I think that even here in the United States, that we need to start to recognize Gandhiji's influence on our own movement. We also need to recognize the environmental movement and studies and sciences also need to recognize non-Western influences. Gandhiji is just one example and one person who I believe probably has influenced our thinkers, our philosophers, and our writers. And I think that we can do this through what we are calling here in the United States, decolonizing academia. that we need to start to reduce barriers of this information exchange. And today, this is one example of how JMI is trying to decolonize academia, much like Gandhi tried to decolonize India. And that reducing those barriers and increasing that exchange through webinars such as this. But I think this can also be accomplished by allowing publications that are published using research dollars, public research dollars, shouldn't be behind paywalls, so that our writings, our teachings, and our ideas can be exchanged with those in other countries. So with that, I will take questions. But if anyone has any further questions or would like to keep in touch, you can do so via email. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Vice Chancellor.
Thank you very much. It was actually, I never expected that it will be so much. A lot of learning has been made by us. You made us realize how we are actually being influenced by Gandhi's thoughts and philosophy in our daily routine work. And it has not only influenced India, but across the world. It has influenced others also. So, like decolonizing academia, reducing the barriers of information. This is something, an example right now going on, and I'm so happy that we are trying to do it. But we never realize that what we are doing is based on Gandhi's. Thanks to your telling us, and we'll try to see how we can learn from our own Gandhi. And Gandhi demonstrated how we can live and how civil disobedience can affect the policies of the government and of others. And he also practiced, he never preached. Many things he never preached, he practiced. And his practice showed us and influenced the environmental policy and many other policies. So we don't have to all the time write or talk about it. We can do it and show that it is possible. He also gave maybe the first time they gave the ideas of environmental justice. By doing a lot of things, you also pointed out I have seen farmers market in Sacramento, a very popular farmers market, everybody going there very happily and coming with a lot of loads of fruits and fresh vegetables. And also that is cutting the middleman's thing in between. So it's the real person who is receiving the benefits of it. Veganism and vegetarianism is again something which has taken the whole world in its grips, because people have we have learned that this can also give us equal strength and equal vitamins and everything. So, and particularly these things that you pointed out has been more effective during the Corona period. It has become now and Corona, many of us have become vegetarians, because that the vegetables are more easily available, and had helped many the vegetable vendors on the roads to earn for their family. And so we are actually sharing the resources, the limited resources with the world, with the people who need it. We are not going to the huge supermarkets and getting it from there, where the farmer is getting the minimum. So sharing and repurposing the recycled material is something that we should start from school and make it a part of their thinking of the children, youngsters, so that we are not really wasting things, but can keep on recycling it. Many things, very important, very interesting, and it was really I sincerely hope that we'll get a full a write-up of this so that we can share it with many other people who have not been here, who have missed it. I'm really grateful for what you have just now spoken in front of us, and also grateful that Professor Robert Nelson, because we asked him to identify a person who can speak on Gandhi's philosophy. So we can, half the credit goes to Professor Robert Nelson, for Robert Nelson to identify the right, proper person who can give us the best possible. I'm sure a number of questions are waiting, so I'll not be there. I'll ask the moderator, Professor Mukesh Ranjan, to take the questions and request you to ask you and Professor Nelson to answer it briefly. Professor Mukesh.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. There are some questions that we have received for the speakers today. This question is for Professor Ajay Singh, and I shall read it out. It is said that non-violent methods of Gandhi also represent an evolutionary approach to resolving disputes within an overall ecological frame. There is now a rethinking on the desirability of development. An idea like happiness does not suggest that high level of material progress is necessary to realize it. Do you think that development is being reconceptualized in the developed and developing countries?
Very much so. Again, I was very specific to the U.S. context, but as is pointed out by the person who asked the question, that we're starting to rethink GDP, or gross domestic product, and gross national product. And now we have a new metric that was adopted by the UN of gross national happiness. Because, and this has been adopted by your neighbor Bhutan, where it was a question of this idea of what is the role of government, what is the goal of development. In the role of government is to have a happy citizenry. And so instead of making the assumption that financial wealth, financial well-being alone is going to lead to happiness, is not very well thought out. And so that we must come up with a different measure of what is happiness, how happy is a citizenry. And part of that being, I'm not as it's been quite a while since I've taken a look at the literature around gross national happiness. But part of that is this idea of human well-being, of making sure that we have some of those basic needs so that we could then rise to the need of self-actualization or self-realization. So again, I think that gross national happiness is an excellent tool and something that we should study further, and I believe needs to be adopted even by folks here in the United States. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
does.
There is another question for you, Professor Ajay Singh, and I shall read it out. And this pertains to the issue that we have been discussing related to vegetarianism. It says, Gandhiji was a staunch vegetarian, and he would have been pleased with a great deal of modern research, which has established that the meat industry has put extreme pressures on the soil and water resources, and the massive increase in levels of meat consumption is only going up. The production of meat has doubled in the last 30 years, and the global meat consumption is projected to reach a staggering 570 million tons by 2050. What is your take on this growing trend?
Well, to answer that question fully, they should take my class, because because I go into this quite in depth in my sustainability class. But this idea of industrial agriculture and industrial animal husbandry is quite problematic. And as was pointed out by the person asking the question, is that this is not just a trend here in the United States, but this is a global trend. And leading the way are those in China and even in India, because as we gain more wealth, we switch protein sources. And that with that protein source, we go to more meat consumption rather than lentils and beans and other vegetables with protein sources. But one of the things here in the United States that might be some insight to it, or say a glimmer of hope, is that there's been, especially since COVID, as is pointed out by the Vice Chancellor, that our access to meat resources, to meats here in the United States went down. There was a rush on meat here in the United States. But at the same time, we started to see an uptick in a number of companies that are investing in meat substitutes that use what we are shifting away from. They are now using chickpeas, lentils, and other vegetable sources in order to create a lot of those meat substitutes. And I myself tonight just ate some one of those meat substitutes, the Impossible Burger, right? So right there you can see that what we're seeing is that there is a shift away from meat sources because there's rising awareness of the impact that animal husbandry has on and industrial animal husbandry has on our environment. So as I said, even though we're seeing increases in other countries and globally, we do see even in the US that meat consumption is starting to decrease because there is an alternative. So there is some hope.
Thank you, Professor Singh. We'll take one more question, and this question is for President Robert Nelson, and I shall read it out. Sir, what in your view would be the best way, and this pertains to our collaboration, sir, what in your view would be the best way to actualize collaborative partnership between Jamia Millia Islamia and California State University, Sacramento? What advice would you offer to faculty and students of both the partnering universities? President Nelson, please.
A few years ago or a few months ago, that would have been an easy answer because we are suffering from everything that's happening with the pandemic. It would have been easy to have our faculty go from one university to another. It's not that easy right now. And it's not that easy in this political environment. But it is possible, as we have proved tonight, to be able to talk to each other and to be able to exchange ideas. There is no reason why a Sac State class that is here cannot be in JMI. There's no reason that a JMI class cannot be a Sac State. There is no reason why our faculty can't cooperate with one another. And so I think that the point tonight is to find new ways of collaborating. We're used to sending one person to another person and just assuming that that's the way it's done. It's not any longer. Let's work to find new ways to collaborate. Let's collaborate on degree programs. We're talking about right now helping JMI with our environment program. Let's make that happen. We can learn just as much from JMI as anybody else. So it's about a long-term commitment. We think in these pandemic times of only tomorrow. Let's think about long-term. Let's think about how we can work together with each other and collaborate. I am terribly impressed with Todd and I. As a kid, and I mean this as a child, I read about Gandhi and I was just blown away. I was just blown away that someone could think in this way. And now, all these years later, we have an opportunity to institutionalize what we're trying to do, to be able to make it from one institution to another. So Sac State is committed, JMI and the Vice Chancellor are totally committed. Let's move forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me say that JMI is with you and we can collaborate. You have shown the way. Today, you have shown the way how we can collaborate in spite of our limitations of traveling and seeing each other face to face. This is how we can collaborate. And our teachers, students, and many other activities we can do together. Our students can make friends in Sac State, and the Sac State students are welcome to know about the culture and know India. And I'm sure when everything clears away, one day we'll be back to normal. And on that day, they can come and actually see India and be our guest.
That will happen. And today you start your day new, and eventually I get to go to sleep tonight.
I'm so sorry that you have delayed your sleeping, but we got up early today. Okay. Thank you very much. Formal vote of thanks has to be given, but before that, I personally thank Professor Nelson, the president of Sac State University, and Professor Ajay Singh, the person who introduced us to Gandhiji in a different way, because it was a learning experience. And we started realizing that, okay, this is also what Gandhiji wanted. So thank you very much, and we'll keep on talking about for our collaborative research topics we can take, and also maybe do some more research on Gandhiji from a different angle. Ajay Singh ji, Professor Ajay Singh has already been invited and almost accepted the environmental to lead our environmental department, which is just starting. So we have got a very good, and with that one can that the leader can be anywhere in the world, but can give us guidance and leadership in that area. And I'm sure I request Professor Nelson to allow him to do that because of the MOU that we have of collaboration. And good luck to both the universities and our collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now a formal vote of thanks.
Professor Robert Nelson, President, California State University, Sacramento, Professor Ajay Singh, Honorable Vice Chancellor, JMI, and other participants. It is my honor and privilege to pursue a vote of thanks on behalf of JMI. It is indeed a historic day for Jamia Millia Islamia, as it has come together with California State University, Sacramento, US, for holding a Gandhi webinar to mark the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. This has been the most befitting manner to kick-start a collaborative partnership between two leading institutions. First and foremost, I wish to thank Professor Robert Nelson, President, California State University, Sacramento, for his inaugural address. President Nelson has talked about the opportunities that could come through to our faculty members and students. I want to assure him that Jamia Millia Islamia would be proactively exploring collaborative opportunities of doing joint research and joint publications, besides facilitating visits of students and teachers to our institutions to promote faculty and student exchange. I want to express our profound appreciation for the lecture delivered by Professor Ajay Singh. He has brilliantly talked about Gandhiji and the US environmental movement to highlight how Gandhiji has contributed to the development of our environmental consciousness. As many speakers have highlighted today, that Gandhiji never saw himself as an environmental activist, but throughout his life, he created a narrative on environmental protection. We are so very indebted to Mahatma Gandhi for highlighting his simplicity of life for the protection of environment. I want to thank Professor Ajay Singh for talking about various environmental movements that have allowed us to see the challenges that exist for securing our environment, not only for ourselves, but also for the whole world. This is our collective responsibility, and no society can afford to disengage itself from it. My special thanks are due to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma, for guiding us all through the webinar series on Gandhiji. She has been a lamp of light for all the stakeholders in the university, and under her leadership, we are on the path of excellence in our activities. It is her vision regarding internationalization of education that has brought Jamia Millia Islamia and California State University Sacramento together. I also thank Professor Mukesh Ranjan for introducing this event to the audience, which has attracted a large number of participants. I want to thank all the students, teachers, guests, and other attendees for both the countries. Indeed, they have made efforts to join the webinar at not so convenient hours. I also thank the participants who have asked questions through the chat box. Finally, I thank all our technical staff led by Dr. Azim Nakvi at the CITMI and Professor Hoffman and MS KD Smart for enabling their executive leadership to be part of this great event. Thank you. Good night to the people in California and very good day to people in India. Now I request our respected Vice Chancellor for the closing remarks of this.
Thank you, Dr. Nazim Hussain Jafri, for this formal vote of thanks. And I think we have now come to an end of this program. And with the permission of Professor Robert Nelson, I will declare this as closed. And I can really feel that it's quite late in the night for you people, and we will, whenever we talk to each other, there will be a time difference and will affect us. But I'm sure once we'll get used to it, and because and keep on shifting it whenever it's possible. So thank you very much for being with us, and looking forward for a very long. Yes, please. Okay, and looking for a very long relationship between these two eminent universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.